The plan was not to become a survival story. When Ernest Shackleton sailed south in 1914, he was not trying to escape Antarctica. He was trying to cross it. The South Pole had already been reached. The great prize that remained, at least in Shackleton's mind, was the first crossing of the Antarctic continent from one sea to the other. His ship Endurance would carry him and his men into the Weddell Sea. From there, a small party would land, march across the continent by way of the pole, and come out on the Ross seaside. It was bold, it was expensive, it was dangerous. But the thing that made the expedition legendary was not the crossing. The crossing never happened. Endurance left South Georgia in December of 1914 and pushed into one of the most difficult seas on Earth. The Weddell Sea was not open water in the way a map might suggest. It was a moving, grinding world of ice, flows, pressure ridges, leads that opened and vanished, and white horizons that could become a trap with almost no warning. At first, the ship fought forward. She was a wooden polar vessel built for ice, with sails and steam, and a crew that understood hardship. But the ice was heavier than expected, and each mile south became more costly. Then, on January 19, 1915, the sea closed around her. Endurance was frozen fast. There was no dramatic wreck at first, no single wave, no explosion, no night of immediate panic. In some ways, what happened was worse. The ship became a prisoner, and the prison moved. The men could look out from the deck and see the same terrible beauty every day. Ice to every horizon, pressure building and releasing, the ship locked into a white plain that drifted with wind and current. They were still alive. They still had shelter. They still had food, dogs, equipment, routines, jokes, arguments, chores. But they were no longer an expedition advancing toward a goal. They were a ship waiting for the ice to decide its fate. Shackleton understood this before everyone wanted to admit it. The original mission was gone. The dream of crossing Antarctica had to be set aside. From that point on, there was only one objective that mattered: bring the men home. That sounds simple now. It was not simple there. There were 28 men tied to the fate of Endurance, and not all of them were famous explorers. Some were officers, some were sailors, some were scientists, some were young men who had signed on for wages, adventure, or the chance to be part of something larger than ordinary life. They had different temperaments, different skills, and different limits. Shackleton's problem was not only distance or temperature, it was people. In a disaster like this, the mind can become as dangerous as the weather. A man who gives up stops pulling his weight. A man who panics can spread panic. A man who feels useless can become a burden to himself and to everyone around him. Shackleton watched moods carefully. He kept difficult personalities close. He used routine like a tool. In a place where the landscape offered no mercy, the group itself had to become a shelter. For months, Endurance drifted. The men lived through darkness, cold, boredom, and uncertainty. Photographer Frank Hurley captured images that still feel unreal. The ship held in the ice, her masts standing against the polar sky. Men reduced to small, dark figures beside a vessel that looked both powerful and helpless. Then the ice began to win. In the spring of 1915, pressure increased around the hull. Ice does not need speed to destroy a ship. It only needs force and time. It pressed against Endurance from both sides, lifted her, twisted her, and squeezed her timbers until the ship began to fail. The men heard it. Wood groaned, beams strained, the hull complained like a living thing. By late October, water was coming in. Pumps could not change the truth. The ship that had carried them into the Antarctic was being crushed. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. Think about what that meant. They were not stepping from a sinking vessel into lifeboats with a port somewhere over the horizon. They were stepping onto ice in the middle of the Weddell Sea, hundreds of miles from help, with no radio rescue, no aircraft, no modern emergency beacon, and no guarantee that the surface beneath them would hold. They dragged supplies out onto the ice. They saved food, tents, sledges, tools, and 3 small boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. Those boats would become everything. The choice of what to save was brutal. Every item had weight. Every pound dragged across the ice had to be paid for by human bodies that were already tired and cold. Equipment that had once seemed essential to an Antarctic crossing could become dead weight in a survival march. Scientific ambition gave way to calories, canvas, tools, and the boats. Even personal possessions had to be judged against the chances of living. Hurley, the photographer, faced his own terrible calculation. His images were the memory of the expedition, but glass plates were heavy. He could not save everything. The survival story we know today exists partly because he saved enough, and because the men understood that even in failure, something about this ordeal deserved to be carried home. On November 21, 1915, Endurance sank. The men watched the stern go down. The masts disappeared. The ship was gone, and with it went the last solid piece of their old life. From that point, they were castaways on a drifting ice floe. Shackleton had to keep them moving, but not too soon. He had to preserve strength, but not let despair settle in. He had to make decisions with incomplete information, and every wrong decision could kill everyone slowly. They tried to march over the ice, hauling the boats. It was brutal work. The surface was broken, ridged, soft in places, and constantly changing. A boat that could save them at sea was a crushing weight on ice. Progress was so slow that the effort became dangerous. So they camped. Ocean Camp, Patience Camp. Even the names sound like tests. Patience was not passive. It was work. The men hunted when they could. They repaired gear. They watched the ice. They listened for cracks. They tried to sleep in tents while the floe beneath them moved through a sea they could not see. The weather could make ordinary tasks feel absurdly difficult. Cooking, drying clothing, keeping hands warm, keeping boots usable, keeping spirits from collapsing. These became the expedition. There was also the knowledge that the ice was carrying them, but not necessarily toward safety. A drift could help them or ruin them. Open water could mean a route out, or it could mean the floe was breaking under their feet. Every change in the surface brought hope and danger together. They waited on the floes while the ice drifted north, hoping it would carry them closer to open water and land. Around them, the world cracked and shifted. A lead might open near the tents. A floe might split. The surface under a man could become unsafe in minutes, and still, order mattered. Meals mattered. Work mattered. Roles mattered. Shackleton knew that survival was not only food and shelter, it was morale. It was rhythm. It was the belief that someone was still making decisions. By April 1916, the ice was breaking apart. Waiting was no longer possible. The men launched the 3 boats into the Southern Ocean. After months on ice, they now had to survive open water. The boats were small, overloaded, and exposed. Freezing, spray-soaked clothing. Men rowed, bailed, steered, and endured the kind of cold that turns every task into pain. They were trying to reach land, but not the land they had dreamed of at the start. They were trying to reach any land at all. On April 15, 1916, they landed on Elephant Island. For the first time in more than a year, the men stood on ground that was not floating. It was a miracle. It was also a trap. The landing did not look like rescue. It looked like a narrow pause in a longer disaster. Elephant Island was steep, cold, storm-beaten, and isolated. The men were exhausted from the boat journey, and some were in terrible condition. Frostbite, exposure, hunger, and wet clothing had been grinding them down. Simply reaching land did not erase any of that. It only gave them a place where the ground would not split open and drift away. Elephant Island was remote, harsh, and far from normal shipping routes. There was no settlement waiting for them. No rescue party knew where they were. The island gave them rocks, ice, wind, penguins, seals, and a place to put their feet. It did not give them a way home. Shackleton faced the central decision of the entire ordeal. Someone had to go for help. The nearest realistic chance was South Georgia, where whaling stations stood on the far side of a violent ocean. The distance was roughly 800 miles. The boat would be the James Caird, only about 22 feet long, strengthened by the carpenter Harry McNish as best as possible with the materials they had. 6 men would go: Shackleton, Frank Worsley, Tom Crean, McNish, John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy. The rest would stay behind under Frank Wild. This is the moment where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, even though it happened. The James Caird was not a ship. It was a small, open boat modified for desperation. It had to cross one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world. If Worsley missed South Georgia, there was no second target. The ocean would simply continue. Navigation depended on skill, instinct, endurance, and rare glimpses of the sun through violent weather. Worsley had to find a tiny island after days of storms, cloud, spray, and exhaustion. McNish's work on the boat mattered before the voyage even began. The James Caird needed to be made as seaworthy as a small lifeboat could be made under impossible conditions. The men raised the sides, added a deck covering, and used what materials they had to give the boat a better chance. It was not comfortable. It was not safe in any normal sense. It was simply less hopeless than the alternatives. The 6 men who climbed into it were not choosing a heroic scene. They were choosing cold, cramped darkness, salt water, thirst, and the possibility of vanishing without a trace. For the men left behind, the James Caird was a rescue mission. For the men inside it, it was a wager against the ocean. On Elephant Island, the men watched the boat leave. Imagine being one of the 22 left behind. You have survived the ship being crushed. You have survived months on the ice. You have survived the boat journey to land. Now the only hope is a small boat vanishing into the sea, carrying the man who promised to return. Days passed, then more days. On the James Caird, the men were soaked, cold, hungry, and battered. Waves threatened to roll them. Ice formed. Sleep was broken and miserable. Every man was essential, but the 2 most important things were the boat staying afloat and Worsley finding the island. There were moments when the sea lifted around them like moving cliffs. There were moments when the boat seemed too small to belong in the same world as the waves. The men had to bail, steer, trim, endure, and trust one another while their bodies were being worn down hour by hour. A wet sleeping bag was not comfort. A ration was not a meal. A few minutes of rest could be broken by the next threat. Worsley's navigation became almost unbelievable in its precision because the margin was so small. He needed the sky to open long enough for observations. He needed to estimate drift, speed, direction, and the effect of storms. South Georgia was not a continent, it was a speck in the Southern Ocean. Missing it would not mean arriving somewhere else, it would mean carrying on into emptiness. After more than 2 weeks, they sighted South Georgia. That alone should have ended the worst of it. It did not. They had reached the island, but storms and surf made landing deadly. When they finally got ashore, they were on the wrong side. The whaling stations were across the mountains, glaciers, and ridges of South Georgia's interior. There was no road. There was no map they could truly rely on for this crossing. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean set out anyway. They climbed and descended through an unknown frozen landscape with almost no margin left in their bodies. They had to keep moving because stopping too long could be fatal. At one point, they slid down a snowy slope because going back was not an option. They followed sound, judgment, and the faint hope that human industry existed somewhere beyond the ice. Then they heard a whistle. It came from the whaling station at Stromness. After all the ice, all the sea, all the hunger and cold, that sound meant civilization. The men who appeared at Stromness barely looked human. They were filthy, exhausted, and weather-burned, but Shackleton had reached help. Still, the story was not over. 22 men were waiting on Elephant Island. Shackleton tried to go back for them. Ice stopped him. He tried again. He was stopped again. Each failed attempt meant the men on the island were still alone, still rationing, still watching the sea. On Elephant Island, Frank Wild kept discipline and hope alive. The men lived in a shelter made from the remaining boats and stones. They endured cold, wet hunger and the mental strain of not knowing whether the James Caird had survived at all. Wild is said to have kept telling them to be ready because the boss might come today. That line matters because it shows what survival looked like for the men who did not get the dramatic voyage. Their courage was quieter. They had to wait without proof. They had to ration without knowing how long the rationing would last. They had to wake up into the same cold, the same beach, the same uncertainty, and still behave as if rescue was possible. In some ways, waiting can be harder than moving. Movement gives the mind a job. Waiting leaves room for imagination. Every day could become the day they were saved, or the day they finally understood no one was coming. Wild's task was to keep that second thought from taking command. Day after day, the boss did not come. Until he did. On August 30, 1916, the Chilean vessel Yelcho, commanded by Luis Pardo, reached Elephant Island with Shackleton aboard. The rescue happened quickly. The ice could close again. There was no time for ceremony. Shackleton counted the men. They were all alive. Every man from the Endurance party had survived. That is why the story lasts. Not because the expedition achieved what it set out to do. It failed. Shackleton never crossed Antarctica. Endurance never reached the landing place. The grand plan collapsed before the real march began. But when the goal became survival, the expedition became something else. A test of leadership, navigation, seamanship, loyalty, and the stubborn human refusal to let disaster have the final word. There are details in this story that should never be softened. The animals did not all survive. The cold was real. The fear was real. The choices were ugly. Shackleton was not magic, and he was not alone. Without Worsley's navigation, McNish's work on the boat, Wild's command on Elephant Island, Crean's strength, Pardo's courage, and the endurance of every man who waited, The ending could have been very different, but the ending remains extraordinary. A ship was crushed by ice. The men were stranded for months in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They crossed ice, then open ocean, then mountains. And when the final rescue came, not one of the Endurance men had been lost. More than a century later, in 2022, the wreck of Endurance was found deep beneath the Weddell Sea. She was upright, preserved in the cold darkness, her name still visible on the stern. It was as if the sea had kept the ship while history kept the men. If you want more true survival stories from the sea, subscribe to Deep Water. And tell me in the comments, if you had been waiting on Elephant Island, would you have believed Shackleton was coming back?